Thanks everyone for joining us today for our soil composting workshop with Nina Prater and Matt Casteel. We're so glad you are here today. Definitely want to give some housekeeping for ones that are joining us right now. We are recording, so if you do not want your face on the recording, please keep your camera off, as well as we will have a Q&A opportunity at the end of presentation. So please add your questions in the chat. I will be assisting our presenters with those questions, and hopefully we could get them all answered today. So let me give brief introductions for our speakers. I want you to know who we have here. We'll start with Nina Prater. She is my co-worker out of the Southeast Regional Office. She is our Sustainable Agriculture Specialist and Outreach Coordinator. And that particular office is located in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Opened the office in the late 80s, so it has been open quite some time. And also we have Matt Casteel, and he's representing and the founder of wurmworks. One of the things I found on his website about his and what he really wants to do is we want to be inspired. Every day we're inspired by the beauty, precision, and brilliance of Mother Nature. That's why at wurmworks LLC, we have a vision of a world that highly values and invests in works and process of healing and rejuvenation, hallmarks of Mother Nature's life-affirming intentionality. So these are the presenters today, and we will be getting started with Nina Prater. I'll turn it over to you, Nina.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I am so excited to be here today with everybody. I'm going to be talking about soil health. Generally, I see we have people from all over the country, and I hope that what I teach you today or share with you today about soil health, you'll be able to put in practice no matter where you are. So I'm going to dive right in and share my screen so I can get right started on the presentation. So as Felicia said, I'm out of our Fayetteville, Arkansas office. My husband and I also have a livestock farm in the area where we raise meat goats, and we have a cow-calf operation and one very large retired sow. We used to raise a lot of pigs. We just couldn't get rid of Lucy. And I've been with NCAT for almost 5 years now, and I'm really passionate about soil health. So I'm gonna just get right to it. First I wanna stop and define healthy soil. Healthy soil, just like healthy anybody, any people, any ecosystem, it's a system that functions as a vibrant living ecosystem, sustaining plants, animals, and humans. So when we talk about healthy soil, we're not talking necessarily about, the mineral part of the soil that most people think of as soil, like the sand, silt, and clay particles. We're really talking about how what goes on among that. We have a whole soil food web. We have a whole ecosystem, and you have to sustain that ecosystem and support it to have healthy soil. You can see in the picture with the two hands holding two different soils. Those are soils that were from the same area, but that were managed differently. And the one with the loose crumbs, and you can see root hairs growing in it, that soil has been managed for soil health. And the other one has not, and it's blocky. It almost looks like a rock, and it would be very hard to grow anything in that soil. So when we talk about healthy soil, we're talking about the whole ecosystem functioning very well to support plant life and to support animals and humans as well. And I think intuitively we know what it looks like. It looks like that loose, crumbly soil. It smells really good. A shovel goes into it easily when you're planting things. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about how we can achieve that intentionally. Roots are really key to this equation. Soil and plant roots have co-evolved, really. And some people call roots a liquid carbon pathway, which is a little bit of an odd term, but let me explain. So plants, we all know, photosynthesize. And when they do that, they're turning sunlight and air and water into liquid carbons, basically liquid sugars. And those, they use those products, carbon products, to build the plant and build the roots. But less well known is that they also exude, it can be anywhere from 20 to 50% of those sugars that they make. They exude them out into the soil to feed the soil food web. And this is really an important part of the soil health process. So I just wanted to highlight that right from the start, that plant roots and plant growth is really a critical tool in soil health. And, you know, a lot of us are growing on farms, we're managing the soil. It's not entirely a natural ecosystem, but we use nature as a model for building soil because nature is what built all this soil in the first place. So we use nature as a model to come up with the soil health principles that I'll talk about in more detail. But just to look at what nature can teach us about how soils were built and how soils are continually maintained. In stable natural ecosystems, several things, there's commonalities no matter where you are. So soils are covered all the time by plants, by plant matter if it's not the growing season, and they're never turned on a field scale. So you don't see tillage in nature. That's a very unnatural process. And there's huge biodiversity in nature, whether you're in a prairie ecosystem where you can have 200 different species in a square meter, or a forest. It's incredibly diverse. You don't see monocultures in nature. And then also in nature, animals and plants are together. They're not separated like they are in modern agriculture a lot of the time. And then also the water cycle is intact. You don't have huge runoff events typically, unless it's a catastrophic weather event. There's water infiltrating the soil like it should. And then also in natural ecosystems, the nutrients cycle within the system. You don't have constant removal of nutrients from a natural ecosystem like there is on a farm a lot of the time. And then the nutrients that do enter a natural ecosystem enter biologically. So through nitrogen fixation, plants removing nitrogen from the atmosphere and making it plant available, and things like that. So you don't have big fertilizer trucks coming into the forest to keep it a fertile ecosystem. It just cycles within the system and slowly builds that fertility over time and maintains it. So just like there's no one, correct correct ecosystem, like there's huge variety across the nation, and there's no one right way to achieve soil health. There's no one way that soil health is built. Every farm is different. Every soil is different. Every farmer is different. Every farmer's goals are different. So I'm not going to give you a recipe that you can go home and build soil health. You have to learn the overarching principles and then figure out how to apply those to your system yourself. There's an infinite number of ways to do this. But once you learn the overarching principles, you can experiment and figure it out how to do it on your farm. So I've mentioned these multiple times, the 5 principles of soil health. There's different organizations boil it down to different numbers. Some have 4, some have 6. But I like to talk about 5 principles of soil health that will help you guide your management decisions on your farm. So these are minimize disturbance, maximize biodiversity, keep the soil covered, keep living roots in the soil as much of the year as possible, and include animals or their byproducts when you can. And I'm going to go into each one of these in more detail, but you can see that these kind of match up with what nature does and how we can see soil built in a natural ecosystem. So first, I'd like to play a little game. I really play this game better in person when I can have everyone raise their hands. But I call this game healthy versus unhealthy soil. In these two pictures, you can see two different soybean fields. And number one, you can see a lot of soil cracking. You can see the plants are yellowing and not as productive. And then on the picture number two, you can't even see the soil. So you can't really tell if it's healthy, but that's actually a good sign that the soil is healthy, is if it's completely covered. You can see they planted soybeans over a mulch system. So it was probably ryegrass or something that they did a roller crimper and then they planted in that, so that the soil has been covered the whole time. And if you pulled that thatch back of grass, you would not see cracking underneath like you can see in picture one. So you can make the determination, at least from these two pictures, you can guess that the picture number two is much healthier than picture number one. And it's all based on how it was managed. So to minimize disturbance, what do I mean by disturbance? That can be physical disturbance like a tillage, or it can be chemical disturbance like using pesticides or large amounts of chemical fertilizer. So when you till the soil, you're exposing bare soil. And when you do that, organic matter is lost. Now, I didn't define organic matter earlier. I should probably mention it because it's really key to healthy soil. Organic matter is any plant matter that is in the soil, and it's usually broken down into categories like the living organic matter, the plants and the microorganisms and things, the dead, so that'd be like plant tissue, broken down leaves, and then the very dead, which is the humus part of the soil, which is very highly decomposed, broken down organic matter that coats the mineral particles of the soil and gives it that really dark color. That's why healthy soils usually are very, very dark. It's because that humus part of the soil. And it's key. This is what drives the soil food web. Everything eats the organic matter. And when you till, it's exposed and to oxygen, and then it is lost as carbon dioxide. So tillage really depletes your organic matter content of your soil. It also degrades soil structure. So it breaks down those crumbs that are so important to soil structure and soil function. And it destroys mycorrhizal fungi. These are beneficial fungi that can form partnerships with plants and help them access nutrients. And adding nitrogen fertilizer can also result in carbon loss, so organic matter loss. Most people think that adding fertilizer is always a good thing. It always makes everything more fertile, but it really, over time, can degrade the system as a whole. So you just have to minimize the use of these things. It can also result in nitrogen fertilizer, can also result in soil acidification, especially in Arkansas. You don't want to around here, you don't want to do anything that makes soil more acidic. It tends to be very acidic already. And then if you have legumes growing, these are the plants that do nitrogen fixation naturally. If you add nitrogen fertilizer, it can actually stop them from doing nitrogen fixation. So you're really not doing yourself any good by adding nitrogen when you could just let the legumes do it. So how in practice do we minimize disturbance? There's a lot of different ways you can do it. A lot of people have been moving to no-till systems or minimum till systems, using no-till seed drills, harrows, spaders, roller crimpers. These are all equipment that can help you achieve your no-till or minimum till goals. And then also some people just switch to a perennial production system instead of doing annual tillage. And then like orchards or things like that, pasture-based systems. Other ways you can minimize tillage is disturbance is, to avoid spraying pesticides or insecticides specifically, you can design your farm to encourage biological control of insect pests. So this will help you reduce those pesticide use, because if you have beneficial insects, like the classic example is ladybugs consuming aphids. If you encourage that kind of control, you will reduce your need for those pesticides in order to produce a crop. So this goes into whole farm design, and really thinking big, but it can make a big difference for soil health overall. And then when you want to add fertility to your soil, if you do it more biologically than chemically, you will be able to support that soil health while having fertile soils. So using, legumes to help you fix nitrogen, or, growing a crop just to till it in. I know I said no tillage, but some people incorporate green manures into the soil. And then adding compost, which is a more balanced diet for your soil food web than just straight nitrogen or straight NPK. Those are ways to minimize disturbance while still achieving your goals. So moving on to the maximize biodiversity on the farm. So this is so important because diverse plant species lead to diverse microbial populations underground. Different plants associate with different soil bacteria and fungi and things like that. And the importance of diversity is, if you have extreme weather events and you only have, say, one species, I know that's impossible, but say you only had one species of bacteria and it doesn't do well in a drought, your whole soil food web would be shut down and your plants wouldn't be able to access the nutrients they need. So if you have diverse species, you'll have species that fill every niche. And so there'll be species cycling nutrients underground in dry spells, in wet spells, hot, cold, all of that. So the more diversity you can have, the better off you are. It really builds a resilient system. Your soils will be able to tolerate the natural swings that farmers have to endure all the time. So maximizing your diversity is really key. So in practice, how do we do that? Growing a diverse array of fruit and vegetable types, all families, different varieties, things like that. And then to achieve diversity over time, planning out your crop rotations carefully can really help your soil. And then including cover crops into your system and making sure that you have a mix of cover crops. That can be a really great tool for adding diversity to your system. There's a bit of a learning curve on which crops grow well together. And I'm not a cover crop expert, but there's a lot of great resources out there to learn more about that. And then if you have a pasture-based system, if you're raising livestock, having diverse pasture plants can really help your soil. Having things growing in the cool season and the warm season, having legumes and grasses and forbs all mixed together, it can really help your soil. It also helps your livestock be more healthy. And then if you are able to include animals into your rotations, that can add microbial diversity. Ruminants especially have a lot of bacteria and things in their guts that when they deposit some manure onto the field, they're kind of inoculating. It's kind of like a probiotic for your soil. So animals can be really great, especially if your soil has been degraded. If you're, dealing with a degraded soil, getting that, it can really give it a boost. And then there's some work being done with inoculated seeds and inoculating your soil with microorganisms like compost teas and things like that. Maybe worm compost. We can hear from Matt about that later. But that's another way to add microorganisms to the soil. And then I always like to give a shout out to wildlife. If you have a piece of land that's just not very productive, maybe returning it to the native ecosystem, it will add diversity to your farmscape. And I think this is really important so we can support our wildlife. I just saw a oriole on our farm for the first time in my 13 years of living there this spring, and it was very exciting. I thought, oh, we're doing something right. So I think including that when you're thinking about diversity, I think that's really important. So keeping the soil covered, this is key. You can see these pictures. These are two different systems where the soil was not kept covered. And one you see erosion and one you see ponding of water. And so just whenever I see a lot of tilled fields, some crop farmers see that as like, oh, that's nicely tilled, that soil's ready to go. It's all about your mindset. I see that and I go, oh, it's so vulnerable. And so exposed soil, really, it can be eroded so easily with wind or water. And so you have to keep it covered. And it also helps with temperature management. Exposed soil in the summer can get really, really hot. And when it gets really hot, the microbes shut down. They operate within a similar temperature window as we humans do. And I know when it's 130 degrees, I wouldn't want to do very much. And the microbes shut down and then they're not cycling nutrients. But if you have it covered, it'll stay within that window of activity for the microbes, and they'll be much more active. And exposed soil really will not infiltrate water the way that we think it will. We see a loose tilled soil and you think, oh, that's just going to suck the water in, but it really doesn't. You want those crumbs there to have those channels between them, and that's what infiltrates the soil. Once you till it up, it really doesn't soak in as well as you think. The picture with the water ponding is an almond orchard in California that had no cover crops between the rows, and it rained. And water in California especially is a precious commodity. But if you're not infiltrating the water, you're not getting any good out of it. So you need the soil to be covered to infiltrate the water. So how do we do this in practice? Keeping it mulched, if you're talking about a garden or a small specialty crop production, mulching the rows, mulching around the plants, and then cover cropping when you're not growing your cash crop. Alley cropping, that's growing something between the trees in an orchard. And then if you have a livestock system, really doing carefully managed grazing is key. A lot of times people think in a pasture system, well, it's got plants on it, so it's covered. But if those plants are really short, it's not really covered. If you walk out into the field and look straight down and you can see soil between the plants, it's not covered. So keeping that grass in your pasture tall will actually keep it covered. And so NCAT and ATTRA has a ton of grazing resources to help you implement, rotational grazing system or things like that. So definitely look into that if you have a livestock system. I thought this was a really interesting case study because it's from 1959 to support the argument to keep the soil covered. This is nothing new. People have known about this for, millennia probably. But this study looked at soils in mulch systems versus unmulched systems. And just to this quote, I won't read it all to you, but it talks about water infiltration and it talks about soil temperature and soil structure. At the bottom, it says soil temperature of mulched soil was 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit and unmulched was up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So it makes a big difference. That's all I wanted to drive home with this study. Okay, so keeping living roots in the soil as much of the year as possible. This is the next soil health principle. Some people call it continuous living cover. So every time you harvest something, you've got something else going in. Roots, like I said at the beginning, really enhance the soil. So if you have continuous living cover, you will have continuous enrichment. The plants will be harvesting sunlight, almost year round if you can manage it, depending on where you are. I grew up in Vermont, so I know there's some months where there's just not going to be photosynthesis happening. But as much of the year as you can grow something, you should try and grow something, because those root exudates feed the soil food web. And that's what will build your soil. So in practice, what does this look like? Diverse cover cropping, careful crop planning. As soon as you harvest something, getting something else in the ground. And then having both cool and warm season crops in your pasture. And then also looking at incorporating perennial production models, having some fruit trees, things like that, perennial vegetables, perennial, all kinds of things. So there's different ways you can do this. One of the pictures here is a rye cover crop being pressed down with a roller crimper. This presses it down, kills the grass so it stops growing, but basically you're growing your own mulch. It's a very cool thing if you haven't seen roller crimpers in action. The other picture shows corn, but it's already got some clover established in between the corn rows. So as soon as that corn is harvested, there will already be a plant growing in there. So it's just, people are getting really creative when they start trying to solve this problem of how to keep living roots in the soil as much of the year as possible. You can come up with all different kinds of creative ways to do this. So including animals, this one, is a little controversial. Not everyone can include animals, and not everyone should if it's not part of your farm goals. But it really can build the soil quickly. This is a picture from our farm. I just love those spring pictures where the grass is really lush. I don't like to show pictures of midsummer where everything is stressed out. But including animals, they're really great nutrient cyclers. They can take, standing grass and turn it into plant available nutrients much faster than you could do without them. So just to break this down a little bit, an average 1,000-pound cow will eat about 25 pounds of dry matter per day. And 80% of that returns to the soil as manure or urine. So that's a huge percentage of that grass that's getting returned straight away. And then 20% becomes a saleable product, turns really delicious, especially if you're raising grass-fed beef. And so you're building the soil while having something to market. And it really stimulates the plant growth. Once the grass gets bitten, there's a burst of growth that it does to recover. So you can really use that growth pulse with carefully managed grazing to build soil. People use chickens in mobile pens and things like that. So if you can't manage large livestock, other animals can be used. People, if they don't want to have livestock themselves, sometimes they partner with a neighbor and bring in their sheep to graze the cover crop and then return the sheep later. So there's a lot of ways you can do it. And then if you just don't want to have anything to do with livestock on your land, some places you just don't have the capacity. Using composted animal manures can be a really good source of nutrients for your soil. And also I encourage, if you have animals, if you're going to use them, get them to do the work for you. If you need some brush cleared, get some goats. If you need some rocks rooted up, get some pigs. And I've heard of people using ducks to control slugs and things like that. you know, there's animals can be your partners with your whole farm management, and then they can also really build soil fertility. And again, a shout out to wildlife. I just really think we need to support our natural ecosystems with our farms. They can, you know, there's a lot of birds that can eat, you know, insect pests and things like that. So making room for that on your farm is really important. So how do you tell if what all your efforts are working? I think it's really important to step back and not just blindly, you know, go forth and keep, you know, putting out a lot of effort. It's good to step back and see, is this working? So I do recommend soil testing periodically. I think, you know, we use our local extension service soil tests. We're looking at soil pH over time and soil organic matter over time, soil nutrient levels over time. Those can all tell you whether you're improving your soil or degrading it. And so I think that's a really powerful tool. There's a lot of other soil tests out there, and that's a whole other subject for another day. But really, if you haven't done any soil testing, I really highly recommend doing it through your local extension service just to get a snapshot of what's going on. And you can also, in addition to that, do on-farm soil assessments. And this is as simple as going out and digging a hole and looking at your soil and feeling it and smelling it. And you can do an earthworm count in like a cubic foot of soil, and then do it again at the same time next year and see if you have more or less earthworms. They're a really good indicator of soil health. Then there's other things like, you know, assessing your soil's color. Is it getting darker over time? That's a bit subjective, but it's a good thing to look for. And then there's something called a Slake Test. And I recommend going on YouTube and Googling soil Slake Test, or searching for soil Slake Test, and watching some of those. They're very cool. They show how your soil interacts with water. And then there's infiltration rings. You can just get an old metal coffee can and, you know, hammer that into the soil and see how fast, you know, a given amount of water infiltrates into the soil to see how your soil health is doing. And then look at your plants. How are they doing? They're a great indicator of soil health. Look at what plants you have. And then also, I just have to give a plug for record keeping, because I know that I overestimate my memory. And a lot of farmers do. They think, oh, I'll remember when I applied that lime. And then a few years later, you will have no memory of what year you applied it. So anytime you add something to your fields, write down what it is, how much it is, when you did it, or what crops you planted and when you planted them, and how much you got from that field. This is a way to chart patterns over time, because building soil health is not something you can do in a year. You have to do it over multiple years. It can seem like a slow process, but if you continually see your inputs going down and your yields going up, then you know you're on the right track. The last point I put on here with a question mark, it's nutrient density meters. These are something I don't think are even on the marketplace yet, but people are trying to develop a tool to measure how nutrient dense your food is. And if your nutrient density of your food is going up, you'll know that your soil health is going up, because you can't have nutrient dense food without healthy soil. So that may be something to look out for in the future. So this is what a typical soil test looks like from the University of Arkansas, and every different lab in every different state organizes the information differently. I'm just going to really quickly go through some key points. I think I mentioned some of these. I always look at soil pH. You need to have your soil pH right for your plants to be able to unlock the nutrients in the soil. And then some places will test for organic matter, and a good number is 5% in most soils. And if you can get higher than that, it's bonus, you know. And then I, look at plant nutrient levels and whether they're low or high, and see if you can correct those as well. And then the recommendations on the soil tests, I would take those with a grain of salt and maybe talk to the people at your extension service about how they give those recommendations, just because they're used to recommending NPK straight, and they're not used to thinking about soil health overall. So you might be able to, achieve your fertility goals using compost or things like that. It's just a little more complicated, and it doesn't fit on a soil test recommendation sheet very well. So you can take these results and talk to your extension service. You can talk to us at ATTRA, and we can help you take your test results and translate them into what you want to do on your farm. Also, soil health can really help save you money over time. And if you're a commercial farmer, this is pretty important. So lowering your input costs, like once you build up your soil health, you will not need as much fertilizer, irrigation, or pesticides to produce a crop. So those are all things farmers spend money on. And so the less money you spend, the more you're saving. And that will really help your profitability. And a lot of studies have been done showing comparable or greater yields if your soil health is high. So you won't be sacrificing yields to build soil health. So that all equals greater profitability and also greater stability over time. You won't, with healthy soil, you will be able to withstand crazy weather events much better, like droughts and huge rain events and things like that. So your profits won't be quite the, it's always up and down for farming, but it won't be quite the roller coaster ride that it will be if your soil is really degraded. Also, just as, I think it's good to know that we on our farms are doing the whole landscape a benefit if we have healthy soil, because we are providing ecological services. We're helping with climate regulation, mitigation of droughts and floods. And then if we have soil erosion, someone downstream is going to have to deal with that. So that's a cost. And then, so all of these things add up across the country. And often we pay as taxpayers. We have to pay to solve these problems that we wouldn't have if everyone had healthy soil. So that's sort of a broader perspective on the financial side of soil health, but I think it's really good to know that we are, we are part of a broad quilt of farmers that if we all do our job right, it'll benefit everybody. Why is this important? Some of you probably know about the Dust Bowl that happened, which is a huge environmental catastrophe and a very complex event that happened over the 1930s. And, many feet of soil was lost. We have the power to prevent this. We understand soil better. We have the power to prevent this, but it is still happening. This is a modern picture from a few years ago of soil wind erosion. And so it's critical. We can't live without soil. So I think it's really, really important that we take this seriously and put it as a priority on our farm management decisions. These are pictures from 2019 of flooding in Little Rock. So this is what happens when soil is turned into basically a parking lot. If your soil does not infiltrate water, it will all run off, and if there's a major storm, it will all end up flooding our towns and cities. And so it's really important that we do our job well. And also, it's beautiful. We create beautiful farmscapes when we build soil, when we have diversity, when we have, in one of these pictures, you see a pumpkin and it's got clover growing around it. So, pumpkins and squashes and things people think of as heavy feeders, but they can be supported by nitrogen fixers right there, and it looks beautiful. And then having a well-managed pasture system, it's really beautiful. And we're choosing to be farmers, most of us. And I think we should choose to live in beautiful places too. It'll keep us motivated year after year. I mean, farming is very hard, but if you're doing it in a beautiful place, you're going to want to keep doing it. So I think that's not to be underestimated. And I really encourage everyone to think big and think long term. If this is a quote from Wes Jackson, who started the Land Institute in Kansas, and they're the ones that are trying to breed perennial grains, like you might have heard of Kernza. And he says, if your life's work can be accomplished in your lifetime, you're not thinking big enough. And I know for our family, you know, it's a 4-generation farm, and we're already, my husband and I are thinking about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren when we make farm decisions. We want our soils to be healthy for this unknown future that we face. And I think it's important to think that big when you're talking about your farm and your soil. So with that, I'll stop there and let Matt take the wheel. I thought you would appreciate this cartoon, Matt. The early bird gets the worm. I just like to finish with, I'm always available for more questions and follow-up support if you have soil questions. It's easiest to get a hold of me by email right now. I'm still working from home because of the pandemic. So Nina P, N-I-N-A-P @ncat.org. You can email me and I'll be happy to answer more questions. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Matt as soon as I figure out how to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Awesome. Thank you, Nina. I was laughing at that cartoon, and you'll see why shortly. Well, thank you everybody for joining. And Felicia, really appreciate the intro, and Nina, awesome info. It's awesome. I'm very excited to be asked to be a part of this today and share kind of what I'm into, what my business is doing here in Jackson, Mississippi, and a little bit about compost in general. And let's see if we can all learn something together today. I do have a little bit of a presentation. So I'll share that here and we'll just kind of play off of that. All right, is everybody seeing this okay? Here we go. Yeah, so it's been quite a journey getting to the point where I am professionally to start wurmworks. Spent 10 years as a humanitarian working on the food system internationally and hunger relief, and having a perspective change and a shift as I was doing that work. I wanted to kind of drill down a little bit and focus more hyper locally and focus more on how do we produce better, highly nutritious food without toxic chemicals and synthetic inputs. And, you know, after lots of working on farms and lots of research, you know, composting was it for me. We have a mission at wurmworks to help our community reduce landfill-bound organic waste, while at the same time producing high quality, all natural soil amendments and products related to those amendments as an alternative to synthetic and chemical products. And so main things that we lift up, and Nina mentioned diversity as one of the biggest pieces of soil health. diversity, justice, creativity are our key indicators of success in what we do every day. So again, with motivation of how I got here, food loss and food waste. If it were its own country, it'd be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. And we know the devastation that methane and excessive amounts of carbon dioxide and other damaging greenhouse gases are. And the truth is when you send your organic waste to the landfill or you decompose it improperly, you're not only losing nutrients, you're emitting these horrible greenhouse gases into our environment. So it's a big thing to think about. Is composting is not just a process that we need to do to have healthy soils. It's a process that we need to do to have healthy communities and healthy countries and healthy environments. Again, 40% of the food in the US is never eaten. But at the same time, 1 in 8 Americans struggle to put enough food on the table. So here in Jackson, Mississippi, we live in a food swamp. One of the biggest things that motivated me to start wurmworks was to help farmers and new farmers, emerging farmers, to put highly nutritious, all natural food out into the market. These are just some lovely pictures of my babies. I have many of these guys that are doing great work at our farm here in Jackson. These are red wigglers. And we can jump right into, we'll talk about basic forms of composting, basic ways of composting. The form that we practice is cold composting or worm composting. There are specific types of worms that you utilize for this process. Not all earthworms are composters, but all composting worms are earthworms. So these right here that you see are Escherichia fetida. They are nicknamed red wigglers, and they're red wigglers for a reason. They are quite wiggly, and they're beautiful red color. Now, for worm composting, the main things you want to think about are what is your, for any form of composting, what is your goal, right? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to compost all the food scraps at your house? Are you trying to compost all the farm waste on your farm? Are you trying to put these inputs into your garden or your farm? What are you trying to accomplish? And as a commercial composter, one of our biggest missions, as previously stated, is to get that organic waste out of the landfill. And so our process consists of multiple types of composting, but worm composting is primarily the main form of composting. When you're thinking about worm composting, it is cold composting. So composting is driven by a number of variables. Top is temperature. Okay, as you think about the environment in which worms like to live and thrive, that's going to be 65 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. They're going to do the majority of their work in that temperature range. They're very resilient. So they can survive temperatures upwards of 100, temperatures close to freezing, and their eggs can actually survive freezing and even hotter temperatures than 100. So very resilient creatures. To do worm composting, you need a number of materials to start with. And this goes with any other type of composting. Red wigglers and composting worms stay on the top. Researchers say 6 to 8 inches, but really it's even closer to the surface from what I find. These red worms are going to be in the top 1 to 3 inches from what I observe in our systems and in the natural world as well. So if you see a red wiggler deep in the topsoil, it might not be a red wiggler. We might need to rethink of which earthworm it is. So earthworms, red wigglers in particular, decomposing that top layer. Many people call it in the natural world duff. Its own natural habitat, honestly, with lots of different organisms and insects and microbes. So when you're doing your worm compost, you want to gather your materials, and that's whatever is on the top decomposing layer of the forest floor. So a lot of what we do is just mirroring what's happening in the natural world. Another thing that Nina mentioned, it's like we need to look to nature to see how to develop systems, to accelerate them to our benefit. And so your basic materials that you need to start worm composting with are your bedding materials and your feedstock. Okay, your bedding materials are consisting of mostly browns and woody materials, leaves, paper, shredded paper, cardboard, wood chips. I wouldn't recommend wood sawdust. It's very tiny unless you're incorporating it in small amounts, as it can kind of compact, just like they're kind of structured like clay particles, which are flat particles that's why clay is so easily compacted. Same thing happens with sawdust. The material is just so small and compacts really easily. You need to incorporate it with a lot of other materials. But again, that's where diversity pops up. Diversity in your bedding materials is so important. Don't just use leaves. Don't just use shredded paper. Don't just use wood chips. The more diversity, the better. And the reason for that primarily is it's a different food source for different microbes, but on every surface of material that you're putting in your bedding, whether it's the paper or the leaves, they all have a microbiome. They all have microbes living on them on the surface. And that's kind of what populates your microbial population in your worm bed or your bin. Now, gather those bedding materials. You can add compost if you would like. That can help inoculate with beneficial microorganisms, but with my experience, you don't have to. You don't have to use compost in your bedding materials for worm compost. Now, mixing those initial bedding materials, you can do that, it's fine. Or you can layer them. That's the beauty of worms, is they mix and move everything. The bedding materials should be saturated with water. So before you place them into your worm bin or your worm bed, whatever receptacle you're using, we'll talk about that in just a second. You want to set them in a bucket or in a bin, some sort of container, fill it halfway with water, and let those sit at least 24 hours to 48 hours. Soak up that water as much as it can to where it's saturated. Before you use that material, dump off the excess water, and then place that material in whatever bin or receptacle you've decided to use. Now, worms are relatively widely available, though recently there's been a North American redworm specifically shortage. So do know that redworms specifically and other composting worms are quite expensive nowadays. So starting small is always a good way to go. I started with a tiny, I think it was a 3-gallon tote, plastic tote. You can go as small as a 3-gallon plastic tote. You can go as large as you want to, as you have a container. In our beds at our worm farm, we do batches, so we have separate beds, and each bed is about 4 by 8. So you can go up even bigger than that if you'd like to. Just be careful with how deep your bed is. Now, once you have your bedding saturated, it's in your bin or your bed, and you get your worms wherever you decide to purchase those worms or find those worms. I would recommend purchasing from a reputable supplier, as there's a lot of mistakes you can make with what worms you're getting, okay, in your backyard. So once you get your worms, they'll come typically packaged in peat moss or some other material that's relatively dry, as it ships a little bit easier that way. When they get to you, make sure that you have your bedding ready to go. You're not having your worms sit in the bag or sit somewhere else before you put them in your bin. Then when you place your worms in your bin, which the bedding material can be all the way to the top of the bin, it can be half of the bin. Place your worms right on top. Okay, just dump them right on top in a pile, and either put a lid or some sort of cover, whether that's burlap or an old coffee bean bag or some sort of old t-shirt or towel. Place that on top for a little while and let those worms kind of make their way into the bedding. You don't want to spread them out or bury them necessarily. They'll go out and they'll find their space as long as there's plenty of moisture. Worms love moisture around 70%. So that's why we always get our bedding materials saturated. You can tell when it's 70% when you take a handful of the material, squeeze it as hard as you can, and you get a little bit of a stream. When you get a few drops, that's about 50%. Okay, so you can go up from there. Worms lay eggs in about 75 to 80% moisture, so keep that in mind. Now your worms are in your bin. Your bedding's there, it's moist, it's happy. Your worms have gone into the material. Now you need to feed your worms. While worms can eat some of the material in your bin, the bedding, worms they're going to really need some high microbial foods. So worms are eating these decomposing materials, but they're eating the decomposing materials for the microbes. Okay, they're actually predators of microbes. So worms are really in it for the microbe juices. That's what they love. They're going to take as much as will fit in their mouth, but it's all for the love of the microbe juices. So while they might eat a little bit in the bedding because there are microbes there, the bedding might not be broken down quite enough by the bacteria, by the fungi, to fit in their mouths. So feedstock for worms. Feedstock is anything from that was a plant or an animal. Preferably it's in small particles, though it doesn't have to be. We put full banana peels. We put all kinds of non-cut up and broken down pieces of organic material into our bins as worm food because it's microbe food. And as microbes start to break that down, it creates more surface area, and the worms can kind of get at that material a little bit better and get it in their mouth for the microbe juices. Now, the way you want to feed, typically to start out, if you're starting in a small bin especially, the big bins are great because worms have plenty of space to move away from overfeeding or not great environments. They can find little pockets of good spaces. With a smaller bin, you need to be more strategic with how you feed. Typically, we do it in a corner to corner to corner to corner progressive feeding style. So start in one corner. Worms, and this is, of course, all variable. All your worms are going to be different. Your worm bin will be completely different than somebody else's worm bin, but typically worms can consume around half of their body weight a day in a mature bin. So when you first start off, don't expect, okay, all these guys are going to eat everything immediately and it's going to be gangbusters. It's not. So just be patient, let the microbes work, let the worms come to the food when it's ready for them. And once that first feeding is finished, and that all, you can't see any more food scraps or manure or whatever that feedstock is you're feeding them, move to the next corner. Okay. You're welcome to continually add more bedding as you feed. It's a good practice, especially if you don't have a lid on your worm bin. You can, once you feed in one corner, just cover it really lightly with a little bit more bedding on top. And that can also keep the level of your bedding up as you continue to feed. So that's the basics of a small bin. So there are a number of bins that you can use, and there are a number of systems. So you can start with a tiny tote, plastic tote. We prefer all wood bins, as the wood can feed beneficial fungus as you go as well, and can be incorporated back into the system, though it is a little bit more labor intensive, because your beds will eventually be eaten up by that fungus and you'll have to replace some boards here and there. But we find that that's our favorite model. Then there are continuous flow through bins that are typically, you can have a household one, but they're typically used more for industrial and commercial vermicomposting. The flow through bins have a metal hardware cloth on the bottom. And the idea is that as you continually feed on top, the worms will move up with each feeding, and in the bottom will collect their worm poop or worm castings, and that'll fall out the bottom once the piece of cardboard on top of that hardware cloth has been broken down. So that hardware cloth is on the bottom, piece of cardboard on top, all your bedding is on top of that, your worms, you feed on top, and as that cardboard gets broken down, it continuously flows through all the way through the bin and falls out the bottom. So you need to make sure with that system, you have something set up where you're able to collect from the bottom. All right. And we can go in a little bit more detail if y'all have questions about more specifics there. Another way to compost is static composting. Most of the time you see it as aerated static composting. This is when forced air, you see the blowers in these pictures, forcing air through PVC underneath, and that's to make sure we keep the environment oxygenated, aerated, right? With worm composting, worms they cannot tolerate low oxygen. So they are solely aerobic organisms. If there's not enough oxygen, they're out of there. So that's why in a worm bin, it's easier to keep everything oxygenated and aerated. Whereas in an aerated static pile, you're basically taking all these raw materials, all your browns, your greens, and your high nitrogen greens, and slapping them together in a big pile and leaving it there. Now, the forced air helps with the things not going anaerobic, but ultimately, from my experience, you're going to typically have some anaerobic middle. So for me, it's not, we do utilize some static composting with our wood chips and our raw materials that kind of sit for years as they get ready to be incorporated into our worm and hot composting. But for a backyard composter, maybe this is a decent option if you have a blower. It just takes a little bit of infrastructure there. Static composting, you hope for worms, which is on these pads. Both of these have concrete pads underneath, or flattened pads, so it's going to be difficult to introduce worms into those piles. So it's going to be difficult to keep that completely aerobic all the time. Thermal composting, lots of different ways to do this. This is traditional composting. A lot of when you see, we're turning our compost, this is what you're thinking of. Most regulations, they vary state by state, but right now, I believe it needs to be at 131 for 10 to 15 days. And the USDA requires fecal chloroform testing, and the organic certification, I don't think they do, but just check your local certification or your local regulations. Though that said, there's a lot of new research that's focused on the soil food web and monitoring things a little bit differently. There are a lot of misconceptions that have been myths been busted. Some other things have changed and shifted. And as we think about thermal composting, we need to think about inputs, same as worm composting, your bedding, your inputs, same as static composting, I guess, if you want an even product. But the basics that I want to put to you guys today with thermal composting, and I show this picture because this is how we started doing it, is with this hardware cloth, this chicken wire, and layering in our browns and greens and high nitrogens. Typically with thermal composting, you've heard of recipe, you got to get your recipe right. And so you always need to start small. All right. Same thing with worm composting. Start small and move up, figure out your recipe, figure out how, it's an iterative process. As you go through the season, it might shift and change because your inputs might shift and change. Okay. So what's been found now is that any pathogen or weed seed issues can be dealt with what's listed here on your screen. 131 or 55C for 3 days. 150, 160 for 2 days, or 170 plus for 1 day. And anybody who has done thermal composting before, does it for a living, or has a system in place, this might be like, you're like, what are you talking about? And this is for the center, right? So every piece of this material needs to be at 131 or 150 or 170 for this period of time. All right. So when you're doing your recipe, your main things you're thinking about are your browns and your greens, but you really need to think about high nitrogen, or what Elaine Ingham calls party food, to kind of get the party started, to get everything rolling. That's super high nitrogen materials. Things like meat or blood or manure or seeds. And then your greens, of course, are any green plant. Okay. Your woody materials are of course, clearly woody materials, your browns, your wood chips, your leaves, your paper. Okay. Now, typically the recipe goes 60-40 or 50-50 browns to greens. What we're finding is you really need to think more in the lines of 60-30-10. So 60 woody materials, 60 browns, 30 greens, and 10 high nitrogen greens. Okay. Now, those things again will change if it's super cold outside. If you live in a climate where it's gets really cold and you still want to compost outside, you might need to adjust that high nitrogen up to 15 to 20% and adjust your regular greens down just a little bit. Now, we've also found that mixing versus layering doesn't matter. Okay, because you're going to have to turn this regardless. So however you first build this, it doesn't matter. You just need to follow the same process of making sure your materials are saturated, just like with the worm composting. So if you have browns that are dried out, which they should be, and if you're storing large amounts of these inputs, drying is the best way to do that. If you can't dry, make sure that you're aerating any wet materials. Okay, so if you cut and you got some green material, dry that stuff out, okay, as fast as you can first. If you can't dry it, keep it aerated or move it, right? Move it around, keep it aerated, or put it into the compost as fast as you can. All right. So I like to layer just because it's easier. I can do it with the recipes easy. And if you're using buckets and you're doing a 10, 30, 60, start with a 10 bucket recipe. Just do 10 buckets. That way you do 1 bucket of high nitrogens, you do 3 buckets of greens, you do 6 buckets of your woody materials or your browns. Okay, and you can layer them, like I said, or you can mix them up initially. That's up to you. We find that in the end, it really doesn't matter. Now, what starts the heat process? What starts the hot compost? Why is worm compost cold and there's still lots of microbes and life and decomposition happening? Whereas in thermal composting, you really need the heat to start that decomposition process. What starts the heat? Well, it's very simple. It's the growth rate of microbes. So it's your growth rate of bacteria. It's your growth rate of fungi. So if you have 1 million bacteria, right, that are dividing and reproducing, that can bring up the temperature by 1 degree. It's pretty amazing. So any heat that you're getting from composting is coming from microbial life. So don't listen to anything else anyone tells you about why the heat is beginning. It's the microbial growth process. Okay. Now, and a lot of times when you look at 170 degrees, people are like, what? That is way too hot. I've always been taught if it gets to 160, you need to turn. Well, previously we did think that. But now new research is showing that when you're getting these high temperatures, the key is to manage that microbial population. And one of the best ways to do that is very simple, and that's to create chimneys or holes in your compost. So if you're using this wire frame and you're getting up to 160 and you don't, the idea is to disturb this and move this pile as little as possible. So turn it as few times as possible. Why? Because the fungi and the microbiology don't like to be moved, right? Especially fungus. And you want to make sure you get your fungal biomass way up. So when you're turning this, what you'll do is you'll have an empty wire. You'll open up this wire one and move your wire to the other side, or you can just set up a new round wire. You'll take the top off because it's cold. You'll put it on a tarp. You'll take that hot middle. You'll put it on the bottom. You'll take the sides and the top. You'll put as much of that top in the middle as you can, and the sides will fill up the rest of the way. So that's when after 3 to 5 turns, you're going to have every piece of that in there. So really 3 turns we're finding is plenty over 15 days. So the making chimneys, when you turn that, all you do is take your little broom handle or a PVC and punch holes into the top all the way through as far as you can get through. the idea is to vent that heat out, vent that carbon dioxide out, and to let oxygen in. All right. Now, if we can stabilize the temperature, that's why we found that even at the higher temperatures, you don't necessarily need to turn if you're keeping the oxygen there. And oxygen is depleted. Why? Because microbes consume oxygen just like we do, right? They're respirating. And as their populations grow and the heat grows, that oxygen depletes. So we need to make sure we get more oxygen in there. So those are the basics there. You'll want to, of course, cure it even after these hot temperatures, kill all pathogens and weed seeds. We utilize this thermal process for all of our kitchen scrap collection that we do to eliminate pathogens, to eliminate weed seeds. And then it goes into our worm system after we've eliminated these risks. So, and reiterate what is high nitrogen, your party food, carbon to nitrogen ratio is 10 to 1, real low. Again, I didn't mention manure. I did mention manures. Legumes, of course, is another good one. Greens, 30 to 1, simple but not complex sugars. It uses the same process of feeding microbes with sugars, just like plant roots do, as Nina mentioned. Any green plant. Your woody feeds the fungi. Woody plants, paper. Love this picture out of our worm bin. That's some nice saprophytic fungus helping to break down those hard carbon structures of the wood chips. All right, all of these processes, once you produce your compost, how do you harvest? So from a worm compost, I do batches. You can do the flow through, and the flow through harvests for you. All right, it ends up in the bottom. With batches, I scoop everything out and put it through this trommel screener. Same thing with hot compost. All right. We do cure our worm compost, usually around 4 to 6 weeks after we harvest. You don't have to do that. We just find that the microbial life has had time to develop. And once it's been screened, you really kind of chop up some of that beneficial fungus and some of your microbes, and you want them to recover really well. Some more screening picks. Screens out your worms or your heavy materials. You put them back into your bin if you're doing batch. And if you're doing flow through, when you're starting a new batch of your flow through, you can put that back in. With your hot compost, if you're just doing piles, there are definitely materials that run off that are not getting in the hot middle. You definitely need to take those overs. Do not put them on the top. Don't reincorporate them. Just take those as overs and start a new hot compost pile with them. Of course, the finished material out the bottom there. Here in Mississippi, they've done some research, as well as most places in the nation, but I like to highlight Mississippi State stuff. This is with our products here with marigolds. So why do this? Why worm compost? Why hot compost? Why static compost? Why do this? Well, you're getting all of the beneficial kickbacks from this, right? You're getting your nutrient cycling. You're getting your nutrient retention. You're getting your water retention. You're getting resistance to disease and pests and parasites. With this here, it shows from left to right, control, then I believe they use Miracle Grow, and then the next is our vermicompost and vermicompost extract, which is a liquid we make with the vermicompost. And then the last picture is Oh, sorry, that was just the extract. And then the last picture is both compost and extract. This is one of my favorite beauties to find under the microscope. Everything is so important to look at under the microscope with compost to make sure you have all your beneficials there. Not all compost is created equal. The reason why we're so intentional about the way we make it is to make sure that all the good guys are there. All the soil food web that can be there is there. This guy is a beneficial nematode. He's a predator. See how big his mouth is? He's whatever will fit in that mouth. He's going to eat other nematodes. He's going to eat other bad guys. He's going to eat whatever can fit in that sucker. So he's really keeping populations in control. And as far as compost in general and understanding why worm compost is different than hot compost or static compost, worm compost, these composting worms inherit a microbiome from their mother, right? Every one of them is inoculated with that at birth. It is one of the most diverse microbiomes in the world. And that is why it's so amazing to use these worms in this process. Coming out the back end, they're going to have all of those nutrients concentrated, everything together in the worm casts. Now, also, don't forget with worm composting, worms don't have to consume everything for them to get, for your material, your vermicompost, to be inoculated and get the same pest and disease suppression and elimination of pathogens and elimination of disease. That's because the mucus layer on the outside of the worms are inoculating everything it passes by and against as well. The soil food web is so important, from microbes to animals. Keeping good soil health manages this in the right way, and utilizing compost in your processes builds the soil food web. Most of the time, if you have issues with compaction, if you have issues with disease or any kind of detrimental infestation, it's because something is awry in the soil food web. Somebody's not there to keep something else in check. And we get everybody here by having complete compost and doing compost in the right way. On the right is my extract brewer. So we brew teas, we brew extracts. Teas are different than extracts in that you add microbial food to grow certain microbial populations. Extract is what's in your compost. And there's so much more. So I know you'll have tons of questions as we go, but basics for composting in general is diversity, diversity, diversity. Okay. And it's also making sure that you're meeting those controls, you're meeting those parameters of temperature, of moisture, of environment. All right. And we'll be happy to answer any questions as we go.
Thank you, Matt, so much. We appreciate both presentations. We do have questions in the chat. Nina, the first question is for you. This is, if you have a rice field, could it have cover crop or is it covered by itself?
Well, I will start by saying I'm not a rice growing expert, but I visited a rice field in the Arkansas Delta, and it didn't have a cover crop growing with the rice, but the farmer, Adam Chappell, who's really put cover crops into use, he always uses cover crops before and after the crop. So you might look into what kinds of things you can grow immediately before and immediately after your rice crop. But I'm not sure if there are other rice farmers doing something more integrated, like growing something alongside the rice or something like that. That might be something to look into, but I I will not pretend to be a rice expert, but great question.
Thanks, Nina. We want to thank Mr. John Culpepper for putting information in from Compost for Good. He said it is some design documents, operating manual, and other support manuals. He have dropped a link in there, so thank you. They're out of upstate New York. Also, I dropped in there a book resource when Nina was talking about perennial. It's a perennial vegetable book, and it does give you access to know what perennial vegetables, regardless of where you are in the country. So the link is in the book. Of course, it's easier to pull an Amazon link, but that's not to say that we're getting paid by Amazon or anything like that. It's just the quickest link I could pull, but the name of the book is within that link if you could click on that. Matt, this is for you. It says there has been recent research that points to the detrimental effect non-native earthworms have had on native ecosystems. Do you take measures to contain your worms, and how do you separate worms prior to field and garden application?
Thank you, Glenna. That's a great question. So surprise, surprise, composting worms are not native to they're either going to be European or Asian in original descent, but it is an issue in certain spaces. So this has gotten a lot of attention in media recently, mostly because of climate change and changing ecosystems, especially in the northern part of North America, where the ice shelf has receded, and now there's layers of duff and materials that are an ecosystem in and of themselves that are being eaten up by earthworm composters that have invaded that space and really are starting to eat up that ecosystem and taking away habitat for other organisms and insects, etc. So as far as sequestering them, you can, here we have a lot of balancing mechanisms, right? Same thing as Kimberly's question is, can you have too many worms in your compost? That, I have never had that issue. Number one, make sure you're feeding them enough. Number two, they will, the population will adjust to the space. Okay. If you think you have too many, that means you are having to feed them multiple times a day or every day. So think about splitting them and creating another bin. As far as garden application, I never recommend adding composting worms to your garden. Never do that. Attract native worms or local worms to your garden by using these worm products or using beneficial and highly complete, biologically complete compost. And that will attract your good beneficial worms to your garden. Charles, the coffee grounds and eggshells, leaves and shredded paper, I love it. That'll work. Do think about coffee grounds and eggshells can really be added in as with your feedstock. You can mix them in with your bedding, and that'll kind of give you a little head start with your microbial population, so your worms will be happy. And coffee grounds are something that are easily broken down and fits in a worm's mouth for the most part.
You see the next one?
Yeah, the temperature.
Yes.
Yeah, temperature, that's really good. And it's tough here in Mississippi too. We find mine are outside under caterpillar tunnels with shade cloth. And I still use shade cloth on top of some of my bins when it gets really additional shade cloth. Do be careful with the shade cloth though, because it will retain heat as well. So make sure you have plenty of airflow if you're going to cover it with shade cloth. The other things you can do are you can even put ice on top. One thing I've had people do is they freeze their scraps or their feedstock and then lay the frozen scraps in on the top of the bed and cover it. But make sure if you do that, you either have a lid or you cover it with some other woody material so you don't have a whole bunch of flying insects that come in and find it first before it fully melts. You can also, of course, you can insulate your bins a little bit better. That also helps. And where you put it matters. So put it under a tree. A lot of people want to think you got to put it in sunlight, and actually a worm bin, you don't want that unless it's super cold where you are. And then you might want a place where you can kind of move it to and from depending on the time of year.
I was going to ask that question, Matt. Does it matter where they're located? Because I know that you have them inside the caterpillar tunnel, but you did say they can be outside.
Oh yeah. And look, I started my tiny bin inside. My wife didn't kick me out of the house, and it's doable. And you can work. That's the beauty of a worm bin, is you can reduce smells. You can reduce any type of negative outputs if you manage the bin correctly. So inside is good if you want to do that, and that really helps you maintain your temps and keep your controls like moisture really easier. But if it's outside, there's no problems. You just got to really watch the moisture, watch the temp. And I would recommend, even with cold composting, even with worm composting, get a composting thermometer so you know exactly how warm it is in there. So you know if you overfed it. If you overfeed, stop and don't feed again, right? And add more woody materials. Okay.
Reputable vendor, if you could recommend.
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll send that to you, Felicia,
okay,
and you can get it out to everybody. Will earthworms help get rid of root knot nematode? So the earthworms will help in that their inoculated gut most of the time will have these predator nematodes that do eat and will consume root knot nematodes. It also can have beneficial fungus that includes the fungus that will capture nematodes in their trap. It's a nematode trapping fungus. It's pretty neat to see under a microscope. But they can, and it's not just out competing or consuming. Well, it's not just consuming, it's also out competing, right? If you have an aerobic environment, that's the beauty of microbiology. The aerobes will always outcompete the anaerobes. The aerobes will always outcompete the anaerobes, and root knot nematodes love and they thrive in low oxygenated space. So that's the key, is you want to blanket everything you can when you utilize these products. That's the beauty of it. You blanket everything from leaves to roots to your soil to your mulching material with good guys. Okay. And those good guys will always outcompete the bad guys as long as everything stays aerobic. Okay. And that means if you got compaction, you need to get in there and help work that compaction with a broad fork, or, get in there somehow and open up slits in your soil and get some life in there. Kim, definitely be careful with straw. It's a struggle. Growing your own straw is the only surefire way, right? But create relationships in your local community, right? There are people that are doing it near you, I promise, that are not using chemicals. Even here in Mississippi, we find, as widespread as it is, there are people who are doing things the way they need to be done. And you can find that, but it's just going to take some searching. But you do, and there are ways to test that. You can send it to a testing center and get your feedstock tested as well, if you want to do that. For herbicides. Yeah, herbicide, especially herbicide carryover. And that's just going to be a risk, especially with composting. You're concentrating these things. You're not eliminating, initially herbicides and pesticides. You're concentrating them, right? The only thing that will eliminate them is their half-life running out and increased microbial activity, right? So the more microbial activity, the more possibility you have to break those things down over time. And it's a big issue. It is a big issue. In any municipal area, you're going to see herbicide damage in backyard gardens because of tainted compost. And so make sure you know where your compost is coming from. Make sure you know where your feedstock is coming from if you're making it yourself.
Matt, let me interject. We got 6 more minutes, but we got 20 questions. We got 20 new questions. So can you speed up just a little bit to try to get as many as we can?
I'm sorry, I'm a very long-winded person in general. So that's the farmer in me coming out. No. The pine cones, definitely. Yeah. So anything that's pine needles, pine cones, cedar stuff, things that have antimicrobial properties to that plant or tree itself, they still can be used. It just needs time to age. And as far as right away, I would be trepidatious at first to just use green pine cones. You probably want to wait and let them dry out and let them age a little bit. Meat, definitely party food. We don't use any meat in our composting processes, but it is something you can do. And that is something, if you have a large farm that you have animal waste, and including not just manure, but animal bodies that you need to get rid of, that is definitely something that you can use as a party food. Chopped oak leaves and kitchen scraps, hadn't got it over 110. Definitely not enough nitrogen. You need to get some high nitrogen guys in there. You need to think about adding some legumes at any of those high green that we mentioned before, or just adjust your ratio of oak leaves to kitchen scraps. And also diversify your browns. Don't just do oak leaves. Add something else, shredded paper, cardboard, that kind of stuff, and that'll help you get your temp up.
And thanks, Zachary, for helping with that question. We appreciate you.
Yes. Beneficial nematodes are definitely found in worm casts. They do that's the beauty of the worm gut, right? The worm is inoculating as much as it is consuming nematodes, and they're making it out, right? So beneficial nematodes, I look at them all the time. Every batch of vermicompost I get, they're in there.
And let me interject. We have 2 links. Please check your chats. Zachary Johnson put in a link. And also Mr. Russell.
Yeah,
Bailey.
Zach. Super excited to be a part of that, Zach. Thanks for commenting. And our vermicompost is part of the Vermibiome project. And it is studying that. So definitely follow, if y'all don't know Zach, definitely follow Zach's work. It is incredible. They're doing a great job of mapping the genome and diversity in vermicompost.
So you see the question, why did you say never add compost worms to the garden?
Yeah. So when you add, so think about it this way. When you add compost worms to your garden, what's the goal there? The goal, I guess, for you is probably to enrich your garden with more nutrients, create pathways and air holes for more fungus and roots. Adding compost worms to your garden is not going to be a great space for you to add your compost worms, because a lot of times in your garden, you're not mulching enough anyway, right? There's not enough mulch space. There's not enough top cover. There's not enough happy worm environment for these compost worms to have a lot of them be added in at once. Now, the other reason I say that is you already have worms that are, if you're doing stuff in ground at your house, you have local worms that will come in and create passageways that will, you have native or local red worms that are there that will help decompose stuff. So I do that for those 2 reasons, but also I don't want people purchasing composting worms to put in their garden. You really need, unless you have a system in place to feed those worms more microbial dense foods, right? So it's just not a great environment for them to be put en masse. That's why you want to use them to compost materials down, create compost, and add that compost to your garden, because then you're getting all the same benefits you want with the microbes you're putting in, the passageways you're creating, and the structure you're creating without adding any compost worms, and they're expensive.
And Matt, could you put I was looking for your information. Could you drop it in the chat? We do have some people that want to visit you. So could you put the information in that where they could reach you if they have other questions as well?
Sure. And you can always follow us on social. And our website is wurmworks.com. Zach, never aerate your worm bin. The worms always, they do it for you. That's the beauty. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to turn it. You don't have to do any of that. The worms, I'll do it for you. They keep it aerobic. There's no additional benefit you're going to get from that.
Great. Well, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. We just appreciate the wealth of information we have received from Nina and Matt. We thank you so much. We have put their information, Nina has shared with you our ATTRA website. That's where you can get a wealth of information as well, quite a bit. So please go to that website, attra.ncat.org. Matt have put in his website, wurmworks, WURM, works.com. And again, Nina P at NCAT.org. So please reach out to them. We apologize. I did an hour and a half, but it seemed like we needed even a little bit more time, but we do want, don't want to hold people any longer. So if you have any burning questions, please reach out to both of them. They'd be glad to assist you. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Matt, for today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have a great day, everyone. And please keep in mind, this is recorded, so it will be up on our NCAT ATTRA YouTube channel very soon. Give us a while, but it's not in the next day or so, but it will be there eventually, so you can go back and re-listen to this recording. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.